Hello lovely people, and welcome to part 2 of the nettle pouch video. So I finished all my fancy stitching, and you can see that I didn't go through on this top part, which is going to form the flap, because I'm going to leave that exposed. But I didn't worry too much down here because I'm going to put a lining in with some kind of pocket. So I'll just talk you through what I did. So on the flap, I think I'd already shown you that I was doing this, you know, the blanket stitch with the interlocking the legs. And then I did some seed stitch here. I used mostly the walnut dyed thread and the nettle dyed thread, and here and there some other bits and bobs that I had for different colours. I did seed stitch in all the little gaps in the lace. I think I'd already shown you that. The blanket stitch I carried right on down over the back because I'm just a bit obsessed with doing that at the moment. And then I've got this circle here where I'd cut out, I did this on the beach actually, so I think you've seen it. I cut out a half circle shape out of some of the walnut dyed cloth. That's a silk and wool chiffon-y type stuff. I couched some of my nettle dyed wool around the outside. This very vibrant colour is some silk thread dyed with Phragmites reed flowers that a friend of mine who lives in Holland sent me. Not the reed flowers, but the dyed thread. And they dye this beautiful acid green. It almost doesn't look natural. It doesn't, it doesn't look like a natural dye. I know Wendy in our Facebook group had to go and posted some pictures. She lives in Canada, and she got the same colours. So yeah, Phragmites. What else did I do? Oh, I did another whipped line of running stitch around the outside of the circle, and then inside when you lift the flap, I had this little motif on a bit of crochet lace that I cut out and just stitched on, just with little stitches however, and a little bead in the middle, and I put a tiny glass bead just to hold it in there. You know, I came up with my needle, went through this tiny bead and went back down. So the tiny bead's holding the bigger bead in place in the centre of that little flower. Here again I did the double whipped running stitch like we did on the coverlet of Comfort, whipping round, weaving in and out this way and then going back the other way. And that was with that same thread dyed with the reed flowers. And then I just did running stitch going this way here. I'd already shown you that bit. And then I went and whipped up some of them, again with different colours. That's that same as that, and then a darker rusty brown. I think that's normal embroidery floss. And then I just did some stitching in between. Here I did 3 lines of French knots in between. There I did some other stitching in between, some more whipping. So you can kind of create a background just with plain running stitch, maybe in a toning colour, and then you can go back into that running stitch and embellish it, or embellish the spaces, you know, within it or whatever. And then the rest of it just gives this lovely ripply texture, which I just adore. Oh, it's alright Stells, that's someone else getting their bin. So that's it really for my fancy stitching. So the pouch will look like this. I did make a mistake after saying last time that you put pencil marks because we're going to cut these corners. I did stitch, I think, into where I'm going to cut, but we'll see what happens. So the next thing I'm going to do is decide exactly where I want it to open and close. So let's say there. If you want to put a ruler on to measure it, you can, to make sure it's straight. And then I'm going to put a few pins now I'm not going to turn any seams in or anything because it's really thick with the woolly blanket. I'm just going to whip stitch the edges together. So I'm going to start by whip stitching down this side. I may also as well, haven't decided yet, whip stitch around here. I might not either because I quite like the raggedy edges, and there's no need to, you know, it's perfectly, in fact when I see it I don't think I will. But if you didn't have nice fluffy edges like this, or you didn't like that, you could blanket stitch or whip stitch entirely around the edge just of your flap, but I'm not gonna. So I don't want to sew all the way down. I only want to sew down to where I marked with a pencil where I didn't stitch. So like that. So like I said, I'm going to whip stitch. I'm going to get off any raggedy ends. I don't know what I'm going to whip stitch with. I want something a bit sturdy. I might just use this, this or this. It's just, what do you call it? Pearl cotton, because it's quite sturdy. So I'm just going to start somewhere up here. And I don't want to take huge big bites, but you need to take enough bites. And that's maybe not very helpful, but the thing is I don't know how sturdy your cloth is. So you need to take, I'm going to take a tiny back stitch first. I could have hidden that, but I didn't, because I never trust a knot completely, certainly not for structural work. Yeah, if your cloth is really sturdy, you can get away with tiny stitches. If your cloth is has got less structure to it, you need to bite deeper in. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to go about 1/8 of an inch, I think. And try not to trap that fluff because I want to keep that there. I'm going to go back up slightly because I started a bit lower down, but I'm basically just whip stitching those two edges together quite close together, because it, you know, it is going to have to hold stuff. You could blanket stitch if you wanted to. I guess you could running stitch depending on your cloth. If you're a machine stitcher, I guess you could go and put it through the sewing machine. I just like it to be rustic. I don't mind that all the layers are staggered. I just want to be sure that it's going to hold it, which I think it is. And if it doesn't, I shall put some more stitches in it. So yeah, I'm just, and I find it easier always to whip stitch from back to front, but you know, you might prefer to go from front to back. So I'm going to go all the way along until I get to where my stitching ends, that place that I marked so carefully, and then on the other side stitched into. And then when I've done that, I'll be back to show you how to deal with the corner. Okay, so I've reached that point there. I'm going to just take one extra stitch on the same spot, and then I'm going to leave this attached and make sure it's right up out of the way. And then I'm going to turn my pouch so that that corner, here's where I just stitched, and get that to lay as flat as I can, so that that corner there is making a right angle like that. Do you see? And get it as even as you can on both sides. So this is going perpendicular through the middle of that triangle that I've made. Is that, I hope that's clear. I hope you can see that. And then making sure my piecing thread is out of the way, I'm going to get my snippies, and I'm going to be brave. I might get away with it actually. And I'm just going to cut that corner off. Like a sail. And now I'm going to get my needle and thread back again, and I'm going to just work it in through the layers, in between the layers, just to get it up to one. Actually, I'll go up to the other end, it makes more sense for stitching. I might do one more stitch now over the very end of the seam I was working on before. And I'm just going to go over and just work it through the layers so that I come out at one end of that new seam that I've just made, like that. And then I'm going to come back through from the back there and just whip stitch that seam together. Now obviously however big a piece you cut off here, you want to cut off the same amount on the other side, so it maybe would have been sensible if I'd measured it. I've got the little piece that fired off that I could use as a template of some kind. You know, measure how long the rest of the seam was that you didn't stitch closed, if that makes sense at all. I can just use this to measure the other one. The other thing is, obviously, the more you cut off, the bigger your gusset will be. So I've come over to the other side. I think I'm just going to go back again, because there's quite big gaps between some of my stitches there, because I wasn't paying attention. That's alright now, maybe one more for luck. And then I can take my thread through into the inside of my pouch. And just do a couple of little back stitches, get rid of the thread here. Just do a couple of little back stitches on the inside and then weave it into the blanket to bury the end and cut it off. And then you will see, I hope, that you have a little gusset in your pouch on one side. So it's, can you see, do you see? So that's one little gusset. So I'm going to go and do exactly the same on the other side. And then I'm going to come back and talk about how I'm going to make the lining. Okay, so I've done both sides. Excuse me, roll my sleeves up, and they nearly match. This side's slightly deeper, but yeah, the thing to do is measure before, when you're stitching down your side, when you stop stitching, measure the bit that's left and put a pencil line, and then do the same thing on the other side before you've cut it, because it's easier than trying to measure when it's on the diagonal. That would be my advice. So the one thing that you will notice is, because it's pulled it in at the bottom, because part of this has become the base, it will splay at the top. Your flap will be wider at the top, but that gives it a nice shape, I think, a nice curvy shape. And the big advantage of doing that, rather than just having a flat pouch, is when you, here comes mower guy, when you open it to look in, do you see how nice and open it sits? So I mean, you could just leave it like that if you just wanted a simple pouch. You don't have to line it, but I promised a lining and a pocket, so that's what we'll do. But yeah, so you imagine you've got all your gubbins in there, all your stuff. You can see it much more easily than in a flat pouch. So that was why I wanted to try it. I've never done a pouch like this before. I've done handbags like this, you know, for years. It's the standard way of putting a gusset in a handbag, or my standard way. So for the lining, I've got this piece of cloth. Now, in order to work out what size you want it to be, it needs to be the width of your pouch between your stitching. My stitching's negligible because I did the whip stitch, so it needs to be this width from here to here, plus another inch, because you'll need 2 half-inch seam allowances. So mine measured 8.5 inches, so my cloth needs to be 9.5 inches in this direction, and then in the other direction it needs to be the face of your pouch, the height of it, so from here to here, which in my case is 4 inches, twice, so that's 8 inches. I hope you're keeping up with me. So twice the height of the face of your pouch, plus the width of the base, which in my case is about 1 inch, plus another inch for seam allowances. So I've got my height is 4, twice that is 8, plus my base of another inch makes 9, plus another inch for 2 half-inch seam allowances makes 10 inches. So I hope you've kept up with that. If not, you can rewind and hear me say it again. So I've got this piece of cloth, which is actually slightly too small, but you know, that's just because that's what I've got. So I've folded it in half. I would do it right sides together if it had a right side. I'm just going to set the pouch to one side for now. Except I'm going to put a pencil line here, the same height as this measurement, so half my gusset. I think that was 5/8. Pretty sure it was, yes, 5/8. So excuse the shiny ruler. So I've got my piece of cloth folded in half, right sides together. I'm going to put a little mark 5/8 up from the bottom there, and the same there. Whoops. Now mine's all wonky and not precise, but you know, if you want to make yours all super precise, then you can. That's why I'm giving you all the measurements. So I've got my 2 little marks. So now I'm going to put pins in that. And then I'm going to do a line of running stitch, 1/2 inch in from the edge, because that was the amount that I left for my seam allowance. So I'll do that, and then I'll come back and do the gusset to match the bottom. Because of course if you just put a flat pocket in there, you'd kind of take away the value of your gusset, so your liner needs to have a gusset as well. So I'll go ahead and stitch that and then I'll be back. I'm just going to use regular sewing cotton. Okay, so we're going a bit wrong today. Before I stitched up the sides, I meant to do the pocket. I've already stitched up one side and I didn't have the camera running, but I've still got another side to show you. But anyway, before you've stitched up one side, while your piece is still flat, you need to put your pocket in. Now I'm just doing a simple double folded bit of cloth just to make it sturdier. Sorry, there's people having a conversation right outside now. So I've measured mine. My pouch, if you remember, was 8.5 inches wide. So I've made my pocket, now I can't remember, 5 inches wide, just so there's a little bit of room at each end. But if I get the original pouch back in, basically you could have it any length you liked, but I just thought I'll have a little pocket because then I can just put little things in that otherwise might get lost in the bottom, you know, in the bottom of the pouch. So maybe have a think about what you might want to keep in there. Maybe you want to keep your scissors in there. Mine just wouldn't quite fit, but I do have another smaller pair of scissors that I sometimes keep in a pouch. Here they are, these little ones, so I could fit those in there. That's maybe handy. But you know, just maybe think about what you'd want your pocket to be for. The other thing is you could have two pockets, of course. You could have one pocket here on the back of your lining and another pocket here on the front of your lining. So whatever, you know, you can make and measure. But you just need to make sure that they fit within your pouch, obviously. So I would make them a good inch or two narrower. So my pouch was 8.5, so that would be 6 or so. And then your height, obviously they can't be any taller than the front of your pouch, otherwise they'll go round inside. And also they need to recess a little bit from the top. So I had 4 inches, so I've gone with a pocket that is 3 inches high, so that it can sit a little bit down from the top, inside obviously, but I'm just showing you. And then the bottom of it will sit nicely against the bottom of the pouch itself. I hope that all makes sense. So I've decided to keep my fluffy edges. You could cut it a bit bigger, stitch it on 3 sides, leave a gap, turn it through. But I'm going to just stitch it raw side out. So it's now going to be super awkward. So I want it to be on the inside of my pouch. It's almost easier to just pull my stitching out, I think, and do it again. But anyway, I'll persevere. So bearing in mind I've got a seam allowance here to get turned over when I sew my pocket inside my pouch, my liner inside my pouch, of 1/2 inch. And then I want this to sit maybe another 1/2 inch below the top level. So I'm going to bring it about 1 inch down, and then I will get it halfway along so I can find the middle of this and just crease it. Will it stay creased? No, because it's raw silk, so I shall put a little pin. And then find the middle of this. Yours won't be sewn yet because you will have learnt from my mistake. So find the middle of that, and that will crease because it's cotton. And then line that up with that and then drop it down about 1 inch. And make sure it's kind of square. And I've obviously got the fold there because that will be the opening of my pocket, and I don't want to stitch that closed. Oops, I got 2 pins there. So I'm just going to pin that in place. And I'm just going to do a line of running stitch, maybe 1/4 inch in from the edge, all the way around. And I won't make you suffer watching me do that because that's going to be super awkward now. If you wanted your pocket even stiffer and you've got something like, you know, if you use interfacing or whatever, you could use that, or a thin bit of felt inside it or whatever, but I think I'll find that sturdy enough. So I'll go ahead and get that stitched in there, and I'll be back when I've done that to show you how to sew up the sides of the lining and put it into the pouch. And then we've only got the closure to do, so I'll be back in a moment. Okay, there's my pocket stitched in. The other thing I always find with pockets is they tend to pull apart here because that's where all the strain is. So I always do an extra back stitch over the fold into just the lining. I hope you can see that. I did it at the beginning and at the end. And I just find that that helps secure those corners down a bit firmer. because you know, as you're putting things in and out of your pocket. Let's try my little scissors. Yeah, they just fit nicely in there, so I think that'll be handy. I can keep those scissors in there because they're not ones I use regularly, but then if I just grab this as a project pouch, it's got its own dedicated pair of scissors. But you might have other ideas for your pouch, just think about it when you're designing your pocket. Right, so let's go back to show you what I did here. So I'll match these back up again. And there's my little line that I drew for where my gusset comes to match the gusset on the outer. And actually I want to do it this way round, because I want to stitch, I'm right-handed, so I want to stitch from right to left, and I want to end up down here. It's just, excuse me, more secure, I think, if you stitch down your side and across your gusset using one continuous thread, rather than stopping and starting here with your knot and your back stitch or whatever. I'm just going to transfer that line over onto the other side so I can see it. There we go. And get my normal piecing cotton. So I'm just going to stitch. Hang on, I had a longer bit somewhere. There it is. I'm just going to stitch my 1/2 inch seam down that side. You can use the locking back stitch method if you like, if you want it to be extra secure. So I've got a knot, I do a back stitch to start. You can't see because it's tone on tone, many apologies, but you go in just behind where you came out and then go forward for 2 running stitches, as small as you can. The smaller they are, the more of them there'll be and the sturdier it'll be. So you go in behind where you came out and forward for 2. I've shown you this many times, but just in case you're new here. And that's called a locking back stitch. It just makes a sturdier seam. Of course, again, if you want to use your sewing machine, you go for it. No shame in that whatsoever. So I'm just going along till I come to that line that I drew. And it's the same principle as with the outer, but it's slightly different because we've got seam allowances. So when I come to my line, I stop. I'm going to take another back stitch on that spot, maybe even 2, just to make sure the end of that seam is anchored. And then I'm going to turn it as we did before, but this time I need to open that seam out flat. So, excuse me, I've got my triangle again, but I need to press that seam open. If you want to go and put an iron on it, you go for it. So press that seam open and try and make sure that you've got this line in the centre of your triangle. If you've got these handy dandy things with the 45-degree line and you want to get super finicky, you can put that on there and check with your line. Otherwise you can just do it by eye. And then you see this little end will go like a pixie hood. You can just push that down flat like that. We're going to snip that off in a minute anyway. And then you need to get a pin. Where's the line I drew? It's there. And just put a pin there, so the line that you drew is your stitching line. So then get your thread, make sure that none of it's got trapped in there, otherwise you're going to cut it off in a minute. Turn it round so I'm stitching right to left, and then because I did that double back stitch, I can just jump my thread over to where I need to be. Now I need to stitch where my pin is, which is on my drawn line, so I'll just take a back stitch there to start me off. And then I'm just going to stitch straight across there. If it's handier for you to transfer your drawn line over to the outside once you've pressed your seam open, you go for it. And this time I'm doing a locking back stitch, and I seem to be doing it every stitch. So I'm doing 1 stitch at a time, but I'm going backwards and forwards, if that makes sense. Get my pin out. This is quite loose weave open cotton, old sheet. It's not very stable cloth. So it's responding to the cloth. You know, when we're working with repurposed cloths and all different kinds of cloths, there's no real point in having rules like you have in conventional patchwork and quilting, where most people are working with brand new quilters cotton all the time, so fairly homogeneous cloth, you know, that's all the same and behaves in the same way, because the cloth isn't always the same with how I work and how many of us work. Okay, so I've finished off my end and I'm snipping that off. So that's why I always give you guidelines and try and explain why and whatever. So now you've got this little bulky bit that you don't really need. Do not cut your stitching line. It sounds ridiculous to say, but I've done it so many times. You carefully sew a seam and then you go and cut it. I don't know why. It's very hard for me to see, but I'm just going to make sure that I leave somewhere in the region of 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and just cut that bulky corner off, like so. Okay, so that's my pouch all sewn up together with its gussets and its pocket. So now I'm going to turn back my seam allowance around the top of about 1/2 inch, which is what I allowed. So I'm going to turn that back and put some pins in it, making sure the top of my pocket stays roughly parallel. Okay, so I've done that, and now you get your main body of your pouch in, and you need to decide whether you want your pocket to be laying against the back of the pouch when the lining's in, or at the front of the pouch. I think I'm going to have it to the back. That's usually what I go for with handbags and such like. So now I'm going to put my finger where the gusset is of the liner and kind of try and match that up with the gusset inside the pouch at that side, and then I can get my seam allowance on my liner to match my seam allowance on my pouch, and I'm going to keep it slightly down inside because I don't want it to show above my fluffy edges there. I've got an edge of an end of thread poking up there, but I shall sort that out when I come to stitch it. So I'll get another pin because there isn't a pin in that place, and pin that side. The stitching's coming apart a bit there, but I'll sort that out when I stitch it in. Then I go to the opposite side and do the same thing, get my finger in that little gusset and just push it into inside so it matches that one. And then match the side seam, again dropping it down somewhat. Put a pin. Make sure I go right through everything, and then I should be able to ease that into line. I hope you can see, and then I can just replace the pins that are already there and use them to stitch the to pin the liner to the pouch. This is really loose weave, this sheet, but hey, it was nearly the right size and I wanted to use it, so there we go. And then the same thing with the other side. I've turned it round. I'll just pull it at each side and then just match those up, just dropping them down slightly, dropping the edge down slightly below the outside edge of the pouch, and remove and replace the pin so they're going through everything. And then when you've done that, all you need to then decide is how you sew that liner in. There's no right or wrong way. The conventional way would be to do a whip stitch with a toning thread that you didn't see, but you could just as easily do it with a running stitch going only into the woolly blanket if you didn't want it to show on the outside. You see my pocket's not quite central, but that's fine, it's a pocket. So what am I going to do? I think I might do the whip stitch. Yeah, so I'll whip stitch. I'll just use my normal sewing cotton that I used before. So I'll just whip stitch that in. I don't think you really need to see me do that. I shall start it off. Okay, so I've just got regular sewing thread, you know, cotton designed for machines, but this is vintage. Get a little knot in it. So I'm just going to start, doesn't really matter where, and I'm going to try and not go all the way through. I'll start somewhere where you can see better and do the awkward bit on my own. So I'm going to go just above, just below where my lining will come to, and go in and poke my tail in. Then I'm going to do a back stitch just to be doubly secure. And then I'm going to come into the fold of the lining, and then I'm going to just take tiny bites just into the woolly blanket. I've got my finger behind so that I can feel if the needle goes right through or not. Even if I do, it won't really show because it's this tan coloured thread. And I'm just going to do that all the way around, taking out the pins as they become redundant, and when I've done that I shall come back to you. Okay, so that's all done. So there's my liner all sewn in reasonably. My pocket was slightly over to one side. I don't know why. It's probably because I'd sewn one side up already, but I don't mind. I really like it. So you can see that, you know, it doesn't quite stand up on its own, although I guess it almost would if you propped it up. But it really opens up nicely, even with that quite, oh there we go, even with that quite small gusset. So you can imagine when you've got all your stuff in there, you can really see what you've got, rather than, I meant to bring that to show you, just one second, rather than pouches that I normally have made in the past, like this one, which I love. I mean, I still love it, but it's just flat, so I literally just stitch the sides up. So you can see that, you know, to get into there, I always have to pull everything out to see what I've got. That's the Fragmites silk, by the way. That was sent to me by my friend. And there's another one, ever so slightly different colour. Probably depending on the type of thread that she dyed. Anyway, reed flowers, common reed flowers. Yeah, so there's quite a difference just that little gusset makes in being, I mean, they're roughly the same height. This is obviously slightly narrower, but do you see the difference? So that was why I wanted to try that, like I said. So this is my go-to way to close a pouch, just to put, this is cloth twine on. This is maybe a bit longer than it needs to be. The advantage of that is that it's a movable feast. So whether you've got a lot, if you've got only a tiny bit of stuff in there, like this one, I can do it. That's Fred grunting. I can, you know, fold it up really small like that. Or if I've got loads of stuff in there, obviously I can have it more, you know, if I've got that stuffed with stuff, I can have it more open. So that's why I like the flexibility of those. So I think that is what I'm going to do on this. But if you decide that, you know, you've got a certain amount of stuff that you're going to keep in it and it's never going to get any fuller, you could do a button, or, you know, just, I don't know, whatever. But I have got my nettle string, because this is my nettle pouch that I twined following Sally Pointer's method. Where I started with it doubled up, so I've got a loop. This, I shared all my nettle foraging adventures on my Ko-fi, I think it was 2 videos ago over for my Ko-fi supporters, but I have shown it here and there on the main channel as well. So I'm going to use that loop to attach it onto the pouch, and then I'll see how neat it ends up. If it's not very neat, I'll put a button on. And that, so I'm just going to judge how much I want to be able to go round. And let's say to there. And I'm just going to cut it. That was brave of me. No messing about. Let's get the stuff out actually. 3 o'clock. I still haven't had any lunch, by the way. So now I want it to be somewhere central. I'm going to find the middle, which is indeed on that piece of lace there. I think because it's got this loop of the nettle fibre, I'm going to just kind of, it's quite hard to pin nettle, do my best. I think I'm just going to whip stitch right round it, maybe with this. And see how it looks. If it doesn't look right, you can always sew a button over it. So I want to hide my knot because I'm keeping the inside of my pouch clean. So I'm just going to go under some handy edge somewhere here. And come up inside. I mean, you may not have nettle string, in which case you could just use ordinary string, or you could make cloth twine, or, you know, whatever. And you may not have a loop in yours, but my thought was just to do it like this. Couching, basically. Well, it is couching. There we go, I've got back round to the beginning. I think that's perfectly fine. Simple and does the job. So I'm just looking for somewhere now to come out with my needle and thread so I can hide my finishing off under this handy fluffy edge. Do a couple of back stitches on the spot. Thread it in. And snip it off. There we go. And then the final thing to be done is I've got these little wooden beads. I'm just going to check the length again. My nettle twine's a bit twisty because it's been coiled up, but I'm hoping with use it will get less twisty. I think I'm going to shorten this ever so slightly. I can always shorten it a bit more once I've threaded the bead on. So I've got these wooden beads that I dyed also with the nettles. So that goes through nicely. I'm just going to judge where it's going to go. Yeah, I think that's good. So I'm going to push it up out of the way for a minute and just tie a knot in my string. Just rustic. I like rustic. Does this string make a good knot? That's good. And I can just undo the two ends. I don't know what will happen with that because it's nettle and not cloth. I'll just let it do its thing. I'll just help it along a bit. It still smells divine, this nettle fibre. I'm just going to trim that and push it down, and there we go. There is my nettle pouch. Now it's not quite the nettle dress which I talked about before. See, this is really twisty, but it'll settle down. It'll settle down with wear. I'm really happy with that. Let's move the grey thing away so you can see it against the wood. So yeah, I've got the space up here in the woolly blanket where I can put some applique pins just into the wool, not right through. And then I can put some needles over the other side. This is usually how I do it with my pouches, a couple of needles of different sizes. And I've got my little pocket for my scissors, because they're the things I use the most. Once you've got a needle and thread on the go, it's the scissors that I keep reaching for, and I don't know where I've put them, so now they've got their own little pocket. And then whatever other threads and bits and bobs I was using for a particular project. I obviously will do it neater than that, but it's just to show you. I can just put them all in there, and then that's a little pouch to go with. In fact, it's quite a big pouch. But that, yeah, that gives me flexibility. I'm now wittering because I'm tired. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoy making your own pouch. I'm very happy with it. I like that shape. It looks like one of those sort of 1980s clutch bags that we used to take to the disco. Only they weren't like this. They were some bright coloured plastic shiny stuff. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to joining me next time for more cloth tales. Lots of love. Kisses. Bye bye.